G'day everyone, here we are in beautiful Port Melbourne, and I thought this might be a great location to finally talk to you about my full review of the a7 III. I have had it now for a number of weeks, and so I thought I'd talk to you about how it's been going, how it compares to my other cameras that I'm using, where I use it in my business. So I thought I'd talk about that all to you now. So what we're going to do, we're going to have an extensive look through all of the features that the camera has to offer, including things like battery, focusing and everything like that. So we're going to look at that all together now. Okay, so let's talk about one of the real big differences between the old A series cameras and the new A series cameras. And one of the main differences is the new battery that's actually come out. This is substantially bigger than the previous battery. In fact, I'm tending to almost get through a whole wedding now with the one battery. They also last for an awful long time in video as well. It really has made a difference to the way I'm shooting. In fact, when I'm shooting a wedding, basically what I'm doing is I'm only changing this battery at the end of the day near the reception. When I originally bought the camera, I bought extra batteries. I actually bought 4 batteries, and I'm only ever needing around 2, so it has made a dramatic difference. In fact, I'm usually averaging around about 1,000 images off this battery from a wedding before I even have to think about replacing it, so it has been an incredible difference. And I'm really hoping now that obviously this battery will be in all the new cameras, including hopefully the a7iii series whenever that's released. Let's talk about the focusing on this camera. It actually has 693 phase detect and 425 contrast detect autofocus points. Now that is incredible. Basically what it's actually got the focusing of the A9. It's actually better in the contrast, and it has the same phase detect. I don't think it's quite as good as the A9 because of the sensor, but the focus still is unbelievable for this camera. I've been using this now in multiple weddings and multiple portrait shoots, and I can tell you that the focusing has never let me down. The low light focusing particularly is really good on this camera now. It's easily as good as anything I used to use when I was shooting my Nikon D4S, which really has been a game changer for me. The eye autofocus too is outstanding. It just follows and just keeps tracking. The tracking of subjects also works really well, and it's great for if a bride is walking down the center of the aisle, for instance, or even if I wanted to basically focus on a model walking on the left hand side of the camera and track her walking down as well. It has worked fantastic. So that really is a game changer in the way that these cameras now are performing. So let's talk about the body. This really now is quite nice to hold. I mean, I haven't got the biggest hands, but my hands do fit really nicely around this with the grip here. I have got the bigger grip that will hold the 2 batteries, but I just don't use that because I am quite comfortable with the size that this body actually is. There's now the joystick on the back of this. There's also the good touch screen that you can use as well. The joystick is really good if you're moving your focus points around, but to be totally honest, I do tend to use the touch screen more than anything, which works really well. So one of the great features now in the new Sony bodies is they are giving you dual card slots in the camera. Only one is a UHS 2 card though, the other is UHS 1, but that doesn't really cause an issue with me. I'm saving the raw files to one card, and then the slower card is just a JPEG backup, but it is giving you that backup that you need, which is fantastic. The door is really quite nice to use. It feels nice and firm, and there's a decent click when you open that door up, but it just is fantastic to have that backup if you need to. One of the other advantages is too that you can save from one card. When that fills, you can then overflow to the next card if you like, but I'm just using it actually as a backup card. So you can shoot RAW and JPEG. You have 14-bit RAW, uncompressed and also compressed. I tend to shoot compressed nearly all the time unless it's something really where I want to be critical with gradients and things like that, where it might be better to shoot uncompressed RAW. The dynamic range in this camera is just incredible. You've got about 14 stops of dynamic range, and I'll let you have a look at that now, and you can see how much you can pull the shadows up from that image. So basically, if you do underexpose and you're protecting the highlights, you can pull those shadows back later on, which is a really great feature. Also, if you do expose a little bit to the right, you can bring those highlights down as well around about a stop, which is also fantastic depending on how you actually like to shoot. So let's talk about the color science in this camera. Sony have improved their color science with every generation of their cameras. Now, particularly with this, the a7 III, the a7R III and the A9, the color science now I believe is really good. And I'll show you a couple of examples. I did a shoot recently where I shot a 5D Mark IV and you can compare that result against the Sony A9 colour, and the A7 III colour has actually been improved a fraction more, so it is getting better and better, and really now I think it's not really an issue any longer. Now let's talk about the ISO. The ISO on this camera is amazing, and actually Max Urov did a demonstration where he compared it against the A7S II, and basically it was equal performance to that, if not a fraction better, up to ridiculously high ISOs. So really using this camera now with very high ISOs is no issue at all. I can safely say that I have used this up to 6400 ISO in photography. I don't really go above that because I add lighting, but I have used it up to that, and really the images are really nice and clean. So that's a really important thing. If you're dealing with video, you can go way above that and still get nice images. So that's another great factor with this camera. Clearly, if you're shooting video now, I really don't think you need anything extra in the ISO department than what this camera can give you, unless you're dealing really with shooting almost in darkness, and that's a really great thing. So let's talk about the image stabilization in this camera. It's around about 5 stops, and that gives you the ability to be able to really slow the shutter down and still hand hold it, which also is an advantage in video and still photography, and I'll show you a couple of examples of that now. In the still side of it, I have been able to hold it really for incredible shutter speeds and still get the image where it's usable, which is a really great feature. Another thing is too, with the hand holding, it really does give you the ability to hand hold. Look, it's not as good as using a gimbal, but it does get you out of trouble, and you can actually hand hold these cameras quite well in your hand without using a tripod or a stabilizer if you really need to. And I have used that in a number of weddings that I've shot and got quite usable footage. Okay, so let's talk about the video features of this camera. The latest Sony cameras, particularly the a7R III, the A9 and the a7 III, have really lifted their game in video features. The a7 III and the A9 are downsampling from 6K, so the footage is incredibly sharp. They really do give you beautiful images. You can only do if you're dealing with NTSC 30p though in 4K, and if you're dealing with PAL you can get 25p. So you can slow those down a fraction if you liked in software, but not much. If you did want to slow the footage down, you would have to use 1080, and then you can get down to 120p. Now there is 2 ways you can do that. You can shoot it in the camera, or you can actually shoot S&Q mode. I do recommend to actually shoot it in the camera, because if you use S&Q mode there is a penalty in quality, so it's far better to shoot it in camera and then slow it down later on in your software that you're actually using. Okay, now the file formats that you can use with this camera, there are multiple log formats. You've got 1, 2 and 3, and also you've got HLG if you want to do that too, for the high definition look that you can get now with the latest TV monitors that are actually out there. So there are multiple formats that you can use. To be honest, I've just been using the standard profile and I've found that amazing. It really is good, and we'll have a look at some of that footage now. Now the video autofocus, particularly in the a7 III and the A9, is outstanding. You can use the touch screen if you like to rack focus, and I've done that quite a lot and it works really well. The face tracking alone is worth buying this camera. It will follow a bride walking down the aisle. It will actually follow a model if you're doing that, even following your kids or whatever you want to do. The face tracking is really reliable, and I've found it really does keep up now to subjects without having to manually type focus. I very rarely use manual focus anymore since I've got these latest cameras, because the autofocus particularly is good enough, and that really does make a difference with me with shooting fusion and stills at the same time. So that is a fantastic feature with this camera. So let's talk about the downsides to this camera. Like anything, there is never a perfect camera out there. This camera is pretty close though, particularly for me. I really don't like using it, and I also, as you know if you follow me, I also have the A9, and there are some things about the A9 that particularly are better than this camera. This camera is better in some features than the A9, but I will talk about the downsides. The EVF particularly is nowhere near as good as what the A9 or the a7R III is, and if you are manually focusing, that can be an issue because the resolution is not quite good enough to get critical focus. So that is one of the downsides to this camera. The EVF is definitely a problem. One of the other things too is I have found that the camera overheated, but I did have it in ridiculous heat. It was well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and on that day it lasted around about 20 odd minutes and then it did shut down. So that could be an issue, but I think that's not an issue with Sony. It basically was operating to the correct temperatures that they said the camera will work in. One of the other things too is it does have silent shutter, but the silent shutter on this camera is nowhere near as sophisticated as the A9. I have seen banding when I've used the silent shutter on this camera under incandescent lighting and strange lighting, and it is unpredictable in that aspect. So you really have to be careful about using this camera on the silent shutter. The other thing too is you will get some rolling shutter with this camera as well. The thing is, if you want to make sure that you can use silent shutter and there's no rolling shutter at all, you really have to then consider getting the A9, and that's why that camera is more expensive, because of the sensor that's built into that camera. Overall though, they're really the only features that I've found that this camera doesn't excel in. Okay, so in summary, how do I feel about this camera as against Sony's other cameras that I've got? Basically, I really do love using this camera. Used all the time with me with my A9. And really no one is the backup to the other. It just depends really what I want to use it on. If I really do need silent shutter, I'll be using my A9. But this has an amazing mechanical shutter. You can do 10 frames per second, and it really is outstanding with everything else. The focus is outstanding, the dynamic range is outstanding. Really, there's not much bad at all to say about this camera. And really, I think if you're dealing with being a new photographer coming into the marketplace, this is by far, I believe, the best camera that is available in the marketplace at this stage to purchase. Particularly if you're dealing with starting from scratch, you could buy something like this camera and then also get something like the Tamron 28-75. And if you're in the US, that's less than $3,000. I mean, what a fantastic camera to start with. The 24 megapixel file size, I believe, is the perfect file size out there. I do have the a7 II, and I very rarely use that now, but due to the file size. I would use that, for instance, if I was doing studio work though, where there was high-end retouching involved. But having said that, this probably is the best all-around camera that is available. The video is outstanding, the focus is outstanding, the dynamic range is outstanding, and apart from those few minor faults that I mentioned before, I think this is amazing value for money. So if you can, please give me a big thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't subscribed to my channel, and I'll see you all again soon for the next video. Bye for now. All right, done, high five.